Good evening, everybody. Hopefully you've gotten in. Joshua is here and we're ready to take it away. Matthew, can we have Joshua?
All
What?
right,
There you
here I
go.
am. Thank you
Thanks,
so
Joshua.
much. So, Sis Maria, thank you for having me again and the
No problem.
Institute. This is a lot of fun. Okay, so today we are going to jump off of our conversation where we ended last time with both the excitement and confusion of the idea of Buddha nature, which we will reintroduce in just a minute. And one of the lasting questions that usually emerges from the introduction of Buddha nature as a concept, and did in fact come up last time, was the question of whether this idea of an inner potentiality for awakening that all of us have is something comparable to a soul, or at least some kind of true self that would help with our, let's say, self-affirmation on a path to overcoming suffering and maybe ease some of our anxiety about ideas like no self and impermanence. So today's class and conversation will be the flip side of Buddha nature, the reminder of what Buddha nature is not, why, in fact, our potentiality for liberation in at least a Buddhist Mahayana context, in the context of the great vehicle of liberation, where practitioners aspire to liberate all beings, as a reminder, why the Buddha nature that emerges in this tradition cannot be a soul or a fixed true self in the sense that many of us would hope it would be. And this is obviously a conversation about our own expectations here on this Zoom as human beings in our contemporary context, especially within a Christian context for those who are familiar with the kind of theological richness of Christianity, of course, but also just to say the issues and the problems we're going to be talking about today already emerged in India nearly 2,000 years ago, which is to say there was already arguing, debate, and we have philosophical evidence of this between Buddhists and both non-Buddhists and skeptical Buddhists about whether Buddha nature feels like a soul or a permanent self. So you'll see this, I always say, is a fun material for me to cover. This is going to be a fun Zoom for me and maybe a less fun Zoom for you. We'll see. Not because I'm going to try to torture you, but just because of the concepts that we're going to introduce today, especially the concept of emptiness, which perhaps you've heard of before. We'll put up on the screen in a minute. This concept of emptiness is both a very heavy duty kind of philosophical challenge for people. It does a lot of work in Buddhist argumentation, and it can be really quite confusing. So again, fun for me, tricky material, a little bit of a challenge, but hopefully, like all of the content in these videos, it's a good challenge so that everyone becomes at least sufficiently curious to learn a little bit more about Buddhism, whether by rewatching videos or following some of the links elsewhere, or kind of carrying out your own search once this kind of mini semester is over. So we're going to lean into the kind of challenging aspects here, and we'll see where it goes. As kind of a refreshing break in a few minutes, we're also going to watch a couple of video clips and even a very short movie clip as a kind of a counterpart to the heavy lifting of the philosophy. So that's something to look forward to. Let's share and jump right in. All right. So here we have a slide from a couple classes ago. Again, the Mahayana, which appears up at the front, this is just our typical review, is the great vehicle. It's a vision of liberation that includes all beings, where practitioners are not just struggling with their own ignorance, their own mistaken attachment to a permanent self which doesn't exist, their own mistaken habits, which we call karma, their own mistaken habits of trying to grasp or desire or hold or attach themselves to the good things, push away, avert themselves from, or even angrily dismiss the negative things as a strategy for happiness, but rather learning, kind of transforming their understanding of the lack of substantiality and lasting nature of their self. And through that revelation, and then continual practice through meditation, through the continual looking for and not finding oneself, essentially kind of ease one's habits of desire and therefore stop suffering. This was the initial model that we presented in the fall. And the Mahayana model takes up the mantle of this liberation practice, kind of grounded in the initial teachings of the Buddha and the Four Truths, and then adds this whole additional agenda. What's the additional agenda in the Great Vehicle? The liberation of all beings. So this is something we've talked about a little in the last couple of classes. So part of this practice, as we've mentioned, both traditionally and then ongoing in East Asian Mahayana Buddhist communities, is the recognition of the necessity of skillfulness. Why skillfulness? Skillfulness means, by the way, not only teaching, but aiding and helping others based on where they are, attending to the needs of individuals so that they can actually properly understand teachings. So this skillfulness, really kind of like an educational mastery in a sense, but a holistic educational mastery, obviously not just on Zoom and in classrooms, but in everyday life, is very much part of the Mahayana vision, right? And so then we said, well, part of the innovations of Mahayana in their Mahayana practitioners, in their desire to be skillful, are, let's say, expansions of or modifications of or changes to the no self idea that we introduced in the fall, right? Not to say that they're rejecting no self as taught by the Buddha, not that at all, but rather they're skillfully playing with ways of presenting this material so that all beings can kind of understand, recognize, and work with this concept of not self, a self that is not lasting, it's not permanent, it's not independent, it's not singular even. Okay, so two ways of thinking about this. The first is all the material we worked on last time. That's the Buddha nature business. That we all have liberation as a capacity in a sense. And by us, I don't mean like the self, not you with your nickname and your family and your social security number and your film preferences and whatever, your dietary restrictions, not that kind of self, but rather the kind of presence of your awareness at every moment that you don't even have to try for. You may remember this discussion, right? Simply by opening your eyes, opening your ears, which you don't even have to do, having a functional nose, having a mind that thinks and reacts, having a sense of your body, all of the emotional experiences we go through. Simply by just having kind of the mechanics of awareness means that in some sense, there is an awake quality to our experience. The whole point is you don't have to try. So this awake quality, which is also our potentiality for liberation, is called Buddha nature. And of course, there's all sorts of arguments about it. So last time you may remember that we introduced multiple different metaphors. We talked about the seed, even the seed that has to be uncovered from inside of a fruit or has to be peeled. Why? Because of all of our habits of desire, attachment, hatred, and otherwise, and jealousy, pride. These mistaken habits keep us from seeing the potentiality inside of us. That's this kind of seed metaphor. And then the seed can be planted and nourished with rain, sunlight, all that stuff. You may remember this. And then we also introduced a different metaphor. Remember the piece of gold that is already perfect, that's in refuse? So the idea here is just to remind us that Buddhists themselves, Buddhist intellectuals in the first centuries of the Common Era and then ever since, have been arguing about really the most skillful way of teaching and thinking about what this Buddha nature is. But in either case, you can, I hope, see in the very beginning of this presentation I'm making that Buddha nature itself is a skillful take on no self, right? It's almost like putting the almost self back into no self. Why? Because of the very real anxiety that practitioners have when you say, hey, you don't even exist the way you think you do at all, right? And also the risk, by the way, of nihilism, which is to say, well, if I don't really exist, who cares what I do? There's no consequences. Big problem we're going to get to today. Okay. So Buddha nature as a skillful approach to the no self problem. That's kind of the introduction here. And then if you want to think more about no self, excuse me, about Buddha nature, we have the prior video and the link to the website from there. And this is going to come back next week in a big way. Okay. But now the fun, emptiness. Emptiness, in a sense, is the opposite of Buddha nature. If Buddha nature is affirming our potential as aware beings to be liberated, in the sense that many people find really comforting. I was joking college class, like this is like the good news, right? if you have good news in certain Christian traditions of kind of evangelical practice, then you can think of Buddha nature as Buddhism's good news that they're spreading, right? Emptiness is the flip side. Emptiness is the expansion of the no self idea to everything. So, Professor, you're saying that myself is always changing, is always dependent on my experiences, on other people, on my past experiences that shape how I kind of pay attention to, focus on, experience, understand the present moment, that myself is also reflected back to me by other human beings who are not me, not to mention all the stuff in my life, right? Like my laptop, my internet connection, if it's good or bad, changes my understanding of myself, right? These are all examples of how the self that we think is somehow independent is actually dependent and constantly changing and also has all many parts, right? The physical aspects of my being, different kind of personalities, types I have, and so on and so forth. So the point here is, as you remember, that the critiques of self have to do with the fact that no aspect of our self is everlasting or singular or independent. So again, we have a lot more on this on other videos. So what's the next step? Well, prepare to freak out, I hope. Everything is the same way. It's not just selves that are made up of smaller parts that are constantly changing, interact with their environment, and can never be defined separate from their environment. Neither can all the stuff in the world. So, in fact, the whole world, all of our experience, in fact, universes in the Mahayana vision, are totally unstable phenomena. That's why cause and effect is functioning. Because stuff, both physical things, but also mental things, are bumping into each other constantly and shifting. And there is no single perspective that captures the reality of things. The universal reality is this, what's called emptiness. So we're going to talk a lot about this concept, right? In fact, for the Mahayana Buddhist tradition, emptiness is even better news than Buddha nature. And some people equate the two, which is a bit confusing. We'll have to get there later. Emptiness is great news. This is why practitioners and teachers have this skillful flexibility to reach other people because nothing is fixed. If apples were always apples, oranges were always fixed as oranges, right? Human beings were always fixed as human beings. I was always fixed as Josh. Carol was always fixed as Carol. Marilee was always fixed as Marilee. Kimberly was fixed as Kimberly, so on and so forth. The United States was fixed as the United States. The United States foreign policy was always fixed as United States foreign policy, so on and so on, from like massive levels to tiny things, right? If these things were fixed, independent, singular, there could be nothing to happen. Like things couldn't interact with each other. There could be no shifts and changes and beauty and trouble and all the good things. So we're going to get to this. But the idea here is that actually emptiness is great news. It's this lack of fixed nature that allows everything to happen in the first place. Now, I wouldn't expect you to take my word for it. We're going to have to walk through this more slowly, right? But this is the kind of talk you get in Mahayana. It's in a blowing up of non-self to everything. So in Tibetan tradition, they often talk about no self of the person and no self of objects. In the Mahayana, they expand no self, therefore, to the objects. That's what we call the emptiness of things. Okay. So let's see if there's anything else we want to share here before watching some videos. And then we're going to dig in, of course, to these details. I would not expect this very brief presentation to be all that clear quite yet. Right. So here, right, as a review, we remember, we've mentioned this a number of times, historical Buddha, Shakyamuni Buddha, the wise person from the Shakya clan, lived maybe 2,500 years ago, teaches these four truths to address the problem of suffering. Change, our responses to change, that's the desire, craving, and so on that make things worse, the possibility of liberation and the path to eliminate it. And the path number four entails, amongst other things, learning that the self doesn't exist. So this is old review. Well, what you start to find in Mahayana are really challenging but provocative discussions of this idea of emptiness, the fact that nothing is fixed, the fact that things are open and interacting with each other constantly and always. And this idea is then applied to, amongst other things, Buddhist teachings itself. So let's stop here with a quick example, and then we're going to explain why this applies to the path itself. Why are we talking about the path again? Because that's the whole theme of this set of um, Zooms, trying to figure out what these different, for some of us, very confusing Buddhist ideas have to do with the actual path to liberation, either quick or slowly. Okay, so let's talk about an apple, and then we're going to talk about the four truths. Okay, does that sound good? All right, I didn't bring props, and I don't think it's worth it for me to go to the kitchen. But imagine we have an apple here, right? Part of our instinct as human beings is to project onto an apple. Sometimes I use a pen, but I think apples are more fun. An apple, some kind of existence on its own, the appleness of the apple. You say, Professor, don't tell me about this emptiness and non-fixed stuff. Give me a break, right? Like I know there is a difference between an apple and an orange. And of course, the Buddha would say, of course, you're right, because they have different causes and conditions, right? You never get an orange from an apple seed. You never get an apple from an orange. No problem, cause and effect. But that's not the problem. The problem is we therefore judge the apple to have appleness in some sense, which is totally and completely counter to our experience, right? Which is to say, apples, if you think about it, everything about an apple is always changing. It starts as a seed and then it grows, and there's this moment that maybe it's red or green or whatever color we're hoping, right? Or maybe we see it at the supermarket and we pick the one that's shiny and looks the right best, that looks most like an apple to us. You can do this experiment on your own, by the way. Go to the supermarket, look at a bunch of apples, and then tell yourself, like, which is the most apple? I bet you'll have answers. You will have an instinct, like, this is the right kind of an apple, which just proves that our conception of apples are funny because all the actual apples don't even live up to our expectation of an apple, right? Right. This is normal. Like, notice next time you see some apples with bruises or apples that are colored incorrectly or otherwise, right? Or by incorrectly, I just mean they're not colored, they don't have the color you expect to see, or they're not shiny, or they're too shiny, whatever it might be. So, what's the point? If you look at an apple, we think that appleness has a certain quality to it. But then if we have to admit all the qualities, the shape of the apple changes, the size of the apple changes, the taste of the apple changes, right? It's really fresh, then it gets kind of mealy, whatever it might be. The color of it changes, and so on and so forth. And it's not just the apple that changes, our experience of it changes, right? So an apple tastes totally different. First bite, fifth bite, seventh apple, right? Even if they're all the apple from the same batch, right? And even if like you have a chemist with you and the molecular makeup of the apples is almost as close to being identical as is humanly possible, which of course none of them are actually identical, right? Your experience of the apple by the seventh apple is totally different. Why? Because of the emptiness of apples. So what does this mean? It means there's no fixed appleness to an apple. It's always changing. It's impermanent. It's always dependent on like the weather, whether at the supermarket they're spraying water on it or not, or leaving it out in really warm weather or warm, kind of a warm temperature or something like that, or it bumps into stuff so you get bruises, or the person behind ahead of you that's looking for the purple apple, like I asked you to look for, drops a couple of them and they get bumped and bruised and the whole thing, right? Or when you interact with it, right? Apples look different if you're far away or you're really close, right? Or if you eat a bunch of them. Why? Because our expectations of the apples, not to mention, right? The transformations are anatomical transformations, and I'm no doctor. I don't understand how this works. But you can see, like, when you're hungry, the apples taste different than when you're not hungry, right? So the point is, all of these pieces are constantly shifting. Why should we care about shifting apples? Doesn't seem like a big deal in a world with real problems, and I'm not trying to make a joke about that. I realize there's real significant problems that I'm sure everyone on the Zoom is really worried about. Why are we talking about apples? Well, it is the very mistake we make, even if it's a subtle mistake. Just apples. Like, Professor, we're just talking about apples. Can we relax? Yeah, but actually, Our expectations of the appleness of apple makes us either really excited to get a good one or upset to get a bad one. And even if we get excited to get a good one, you may remember from last half of the class, from the first semester, that expectation of the deliciousness when you have a good one is what's going to lead to your future disappointment when you don't get a one that matches your expectation, and so on and so forth. So the point is, it's this projection onto things. By the way, this is very easy when you think about other human beings, our expectations about the essence of this person. This is a friendly person. This is an unkind person. This is a moral person. This is an immoral person. By the way, there may be cause and effect relationships here at play. I'm not saying that the person who uses an ethnic slur when they see you on the street is the same thing as your best friend. And yet, both of those human beings, right? Let's say the racist one and the loving one is constantly changing, right? Not just on their own. It's not just that their body is changing and their mind is changing and their experience is changing and they're made up of different parts, all those things, but your expectations of them, your view of them, right, is constantly changing. You just think about it with your friends. Once you have certain expectations of them, then the kind things they do or the considerate things they do, you might not even notice anymore because it's just par for the course. See? So if someone remembers your birthday, like at work or otherwise, you can't believe how considerate they are, right? And then, you get to be friends with them. And then 5 years later, you're upset if they forgot your birthday, right? Same person. But what's happened is the consideration or the kindness of the person, just like the deliciousness or the taste or the healthiness or the beautiful color or otherwise of the apple are constantly changing, interacting with our expectations and otherwise. So obviously, this is a lot of material here. If you'd like on the video, you can go back and listen to the last 10 minutes again, or I can help eventually refer you to other sources for emptiness. But the point that we need really right now before we do the videos is to recognize that there's an intimate connection between our projection of our expectations onto other things, whether they're people or apples, of what? Lasting nature, singular nature, independence. The apple is delicious because of the apple, not because of me. Right? The ice cream is delicious because of the ice cream, not because of me. This is the best pizza slice in New York City, not because of me, because of the pizza slice. Everyone else says so on the internet, right? This is the best political party, or this is the best policy, because objectively it is, not because of me, not because of changing circumstances, you see? Okay, so this is the idea of emptiness. Now, we have to talk about the implications of it, obviously, about emptiness. We'll go a little bit deeper. But the first thing I want to suggest is that the idea of emptiness is built into Buddhist religiosity in the Mahayana tradition. That's why we're about to talk about this group of texts that ironically criticizes the Four Truths. Okay? Because these very texts that propose the unfixedness of things, the open quality of things, the flexibility of things that we are calling emptiness, are themselves very, what we might call holy texts, which is to say there's a certain reverence and even a magical quality that real Buddhist communities attribute to the magic of this idea of emptiness. This is no like academic philosophical position, even though it probably sounds that way because you have a professor who won't stop talking to you about it right now. But that's one of the reasons I want to show you these videos. These ideas of emptiness, of the non-fixedness of things, is really considered to be magical and potent. So that's the preview here. I'm going to get back to the slides. I'm going to try to prove it to you, at least briefly, with some examples. All right. So a minute or two ago, I was introducing this set of discourses. These are really kind of scriptures. They're holy texts attributed to not only the historical Buddha, Shakyamuni Buddha, but also some of his students, especially those practitioners of the Mahayana path. And lo and behold, you may remember a couple classes ago, we looked at images of Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva, the being who's aspiring to liberate all beings, who is a kind of an expert at compassion. And in some of these texts, these perfection of wisdom scriptures we're about to talk about, Avalokiteshvara, the kind of superhero of compassion, is the one doing the talking. So it's not just Shakyamuni Buddha, it's also some of his Mahayana friends. But in any event, in these sets of discourses, and there are many of them, really short ones, as short as one syllable, ah is the whole text, and really long ones, thousands of stanzas, right? You get this teaching of emptiness. So here you see emptiness meaning something like an expansion of the recognition that self is dependent. We've talked about that at least a little bit today. That's here on the slide, right? And expanding it to recognize all things are dependent, not just me, but other people, not just like social entities like the United States or the YMCA or the Catholic Church, but also things like apples and pens and chairs and tables and glasses and stuff like that. So, what's the new piece? What's so radical and really crazy about these Perfection of Wisdom Sutras that, believe it or not, are considered to be magical, I'm going to show you, is that they explain that this idea of emptiness, the openness of things, even applies to ideas. And not just any ideas, some of the ideas that the Buddha used to yap about, like the Four Truths. So, one of the most famous Perfection of Wisdom discourses called the Heart Sutra, which I'm going to show you, which is probably the most common prayer, or at least one of the, let's say, top five most common prayers and therefore chants in all of East Asian Buddhism and Mahayana Buddhism. The Heart Sutra very famously talks about the emptiness, the lack of substantiality of even these four things, the suffering, cause, ending, and the path. So I want to briefly talk about that, and then we can drop all of our confusion and see what people do with this idea. So first, the concept of the emptiness of concepts, right? This is a tough one. And in fact, this idea got Buddhist philosophers into a lot of trouble. What's the proposal? It's not just apples and pens and glasses and computers and human beings and selves that are insubstantial, changing, flexible, and so on. It's also ideas, statements about those things. Why? Because all ideas, if you think about it, that you ever interact with are always mediated through changing phenomena. There's no such thing per Plato in the Buddhist idea of just an idea on its own. An idea, right, is always transmitted through language. Languages are always changing. Is that clear? Which is always dependent on the person speaking and the person listening and the social expectations around that language. Not to mention if you're reading a book, this is my wife's notes about something here, right? Then it's dependent on pens and paper and eyesight and light, right? If I turn off the light, right? There go the ideas. We can't even read them anymore, you see? So we have this idea that ideas operate somehow on a separate plane outside of all of the changing phenomenon, which is a beautiful idea in philosophy. But Buddhists in this context will just say, yeah, but show me. You'll never find them in. They're always dependent. Why is this going to get Buddhists in trouble? Because guess what idea is equally empty? Which idea is equally susceptible to the recognition of change and dependence? Emptiness itself. This is called the emptiness of emptiness. So there's some really funny texts. By funny, I mean they make you feel like you're hitting your head against the wall, but there are jokes in them, in a sense. And what happens in one of these very, very famous texts um, is that you have non-Buddhist interlocutors with a very famous Buddhist philosopher from, we think maybe lived in the second century. And they say, Nagarjuna, that's his name. They say, we got you. They say, if emptiness is empty, if the idea that you're presenting to us is insubstantial and changing and non-independent and non-singular like everything else, then you can't even state it. So you don't have a position, right? If emptiness is empty, then there's nothing real in the world at all. And so therefore, there is no such thing as emptiness. And they say, haha, we tricked you. And then the whole rest of the text is him flipping the tables on them and showing how that's actually not the case. And to get this is when the banging the head against the wall starts. But the point is, this is really big trouble intellectually for Buddhists. They have to explain how everything is changing and dependent, even Buddhist teachings themselves. Yikes. But, and this is skipping ahead, we'll kind of close with this either this time or next time. One of the ideas that we're going to keep on coming back to, we hopefully start to see some of the method of the madness here, which frankly might just be madness. One of the things they're going to say is the best way to understand concepts and teachings like emptiness is through the principle of skillfulness. And emptiness is a skillful teaching, even if it's empty, because of cause and effect. So we're going to take a little break here. No, we're not going to stop the Zoom. I appreciate that you're here. We're not going to stop the Zoom, but we're going to take a break by watching these videos. But then we're going to come back to really focus us on this idea. What on earth does emptiness or the insubstantiality of things have to do with skillfulness? What, in other words, does it have to do with cause and effect? If everything is just random, you see, if things are bumping into each other and dependent and always shifting, and you can never find an apple that's truly an apple, is everything just chaos and random and hopeless and nihilistic? And therefore, there's no moral responsibility and there's no people, anyways. So I should just go grab stuff, eat as much as I can, right? Steal things if I need to, stay up all night. No, the position is no, because the whole principle of independence, interdependence, change has to do with cause and effect. There are consequences to things. Whew. Okay, so we have a lot to get to here, slowly but surely. I promise you, this tricky conversation about insubstantiality and fluidity and apples and so on is going to be necessary to understand our last couple weeks, where we really talk about the magic of instant awakening. And it really is magical in some of these traditions. Okay, but we need this piece first. All right. So to lure you in, I hope a little bit to the sense of the magic that I just suggested in this teaching of fluidity, I want to show you some videos, please, of people chanting and then actually inscribing or carving the Heart Sutra, which is a text all about emptiness, even the emptiness of the Four Noble Truths. Why? Because you'll see, I hope, in the kind of devotional attitude towards this text, a sense that the very speaking of and interacting with this beautiful presentation, this skillful presentation of reality, which is nonetheless insubstantial, human beings, real Buddhist human beings, not only generate a sense of community and devotion, but also a sense of like the possibility in the world. That this idea of emptiness and the brilliant way that Buddhists, in fact, this case, the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara, but also other Buddhas have presented emptiness as a teaching itself literally is the most magical thing on earth. It can almost accomplish anything, right? So rather, from their perspective, that emptiness, the insubstantiality of things being nihilism, being a description of everything as chaos, it's the very opposite. It's the skillful application of wisdom, of understanding that in a world where things are shifting and interacting, remarkable things are possible, including, by the way, enlightenment. So even if none of the content here makes any sense, and it may not based on my poor presentation, I don't know. I hope that we can see a little bit how devoted very real human beings are to this possibility. Ah, things are insubstantial and always shifting. Wonderful. Okay, so let's watch a couple videos and then a clip from a famous film. So we're going to watch video clips from a Taiwanese, a Chinese Buddhist community chanting in Chinese, the Heart Sutra. This is from a community that's an internationally successful community. I'll make the links under the videos that Matthew helps us with later if you want to learn more about them. Then we're going to look at a Korean chanting, another Mahayana community. And then we're going to look at an interesting example in French. And this last example is going to be of a community associated with the late great teacher Thich Nhat Hanh, who I just mentioned by name because some people have heard of him, who is from a Vietnamese Mahayana community. And then for various political reasons and otherwise, he set up shop in France. So we're going to hear a French rendition that his community created of Heart Sutra. Okay, so here we're going to see kind of the sense of emptiness as a subject of devotion, of magic, and of community. All right. Wish us good luck with the video clips. So this is just a really quick clip. Are you guys having a hard, Carol, are you having a hard time hearing it? No, okay. Um, Apologies then. I can just never tell if the sound is coming through. Sounds like it was. So here you see one example of a Buddhist community in front of massive images of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, rhythmically chanting, really devotionally as a prayer, this declaration that everything is empty. You get a taste of this, right? So let's do another example. This is going to be the Korean example. By the way, the fact that Heart Sutra is translated into all of these different languages, I think tells you something important as well. It's really kind of a beautiful prayer. You can go and watch more if you like. Okay. And let's try one last one here.
Joshua, can you
Yep.
make sure that everyone is hearing it? I was not able to hear the chant. I saw the video. So can you just ask the group, and Matthew, if you're here, um, did everyone hear did everyone hear the chant?
Sounds like maybe not. Sister Maria, did you all hear the first Chinese chant and not the second one, or
No, I
neither?
didn't hear either.
Okay, so
I
why don't
did
we,
not hear either. I don't know
okay,
about everybody else on the
sure, that's no
screen.
problem. I'll change the settings here on my Zoom and we'll try again with both of them quickly. Okay, and we'll see how that goes. Well,
There's somebody just texted me and said we can't hear.
okay, yeah, so why don't we try this again? I think I just have to probably click every time.
Okay.
And let's see how this goes. All right.
Okay, good, Matt. Good.
Super. My apologies. Thank you, everyone. Coming through?
Le sutra de la sagesse qui nous mène à l'autre rive. Avalokiteshvara, en pratiquant profondément la sagesse qui nous mène à l'autre rive, découvrir soudainement que les saints
All right, so here we get like three really beautiful examples, right? In Chinese, and then in Korean, and then in French from a Vietnamese Mahayana Buddhist community of communal devotion, the Heart Sutra as a prayer, an offering, really, and also an aspiration for the liberatory capacity of emptiness as a teaching. So regardless of how far we get with this idea, which of course we'll pick up with next week again as well, right? We can see that the magic of this idea that things are not fixed. Apples are never just apples, right? Cells are never just cells. Pens are never just pens. Computers are never just computers, but rather all of these pieces are constantly shifting, interacting, and are radically dependent, even the teachings themselves. Even Buddhist teachings themselves are radically interdependent, right? Dependent on teachers and students and changing circumstances. This is really an aspirational prayer with that's at the heart of the Mahayana path. The very possibility for things to be shifting, skillfully or unskillfully, of course, but at least potentially skillfully shifting, right, is what allows for the very possibility of liberation of all beings to be imagined in the first place. So I'm hoping we're getting a little taste of it. The last example I have to have on mute because of the video I was able to find from a very famous Korean film that came out in 2003 by a famous director named Kim Ki-duk called Spring, Summer, Fall, Winter, and Spring. Perhaps some people have seen it. And in this example, without kind of ruining too much of the film, right, you have a student of a teacher who had left and then come back after it's clear that he made a terrible crime. He committed a terrible crime. And he's about to get arrested for the crime at the monastery, which, by the way, is stunningly portrayed as in the middle of a lake. And it's like on a tiny island, you'll see. In any event, and so what does his teacher have him do as a part of the kind of process of acknowledging his own really serious moral mistake? He carves the Heart Sutra. Okay, and then he gets taken off by the authorities. So I just want to show you this, that Heart Sutra isn't just a spoken prayer, the very even carving of it, the writing of it. In this case, if I believe, I don't remember if he uses Chinese characters or if it's the text using Chinese characters in Japanese, I don't know. But in any event, it's the very writing of it, the engaging with this transformative idea and kind of possibility of the emptiness of things is a moral act. Okay, so let me just briefly show you this. And I cannot recommend this provocative, in some sense controversial, and stunningly beautiful film enough. Okay, so here's our last video clip. This one is going to be quiet because the language here from the YouTube is not from the film. So please don't be upset that you won't be able to hear anything. But you'll notice here, these are the characters of the Heart Sutra that this man is carving. All night. And now he's taken away by the authorities. That's his teacher. So the film scene is much longer, but just to give you a taste, that's what I was able to find for us here. The Heart Sutra is as an embodiment of the teaching of emptiness, a prayer, kind of a communal technique and ritual. And it's also a source of tremendous ritual and moral power. Okay, why, you might ask, right? Why? Let's talk about it a little bit, then we'll start taking questions. Okay, so here we have the Heart Sutra as a prayer, right? Well, part of the idea is that because things are always dependent on one another, the labeling that we put on things, an apple, or a Macintosh apple, or a Granny Smith apple, or a ripe apple, or a mealy apple, right? Or an organic apple. We have a lot of ideas about apples, right? Are not entirely accurate because things are always shifting. Is that clear? And yet we need to talk about things, including the Buddha in his Four Truths need to talk about things because without conventions, normalized social conventions, which by the way often are behavioral, as you know, but this includes the use of language. Without conventions, we can't understand anything. But it's this very looseness of conventions that they're common, agreed upon, sometimes shifting linguistic and social phenomenon that is evidence of emptiness. If language was just fixed, you wouldn't be able to hear it, let alone understand it or grow to learn from it or apply a certain associations to it or have memories attached to them, right? Otherwise, you'd go to school, second graders, they never learn a thing. It'd be fixed, you see? No one would ever read poetry or reread a book, you see? So this very looseness, even of ideas, is what allows them to work. This is the connection of emptiness to the skillfulness piece. So this is where it gets really tricky. I was hinting at this earlier. Sometimes people get nervous. By sometimes, I mean always, if we're taking material seriously. Always 2,000 years ago, there's evidence of this. Always now in 2026. People say, hey, emptiness, if there's a world without fixed meaning, fixed entities, right? Fixed essences or fixed selves, then how can anything mean anything at all? It's just chaos. Remember this idea? And actually, the argument is exactly the opposite. In some Tibetan deliveries of this teaching, they say this is the hardest idea to really understand, by the way, but we'll give it a shot. The very looseness of things is what makes cause and effect possible. Rather than our instinct that emptiness, the non-fixed nature of things, the fact that things are always changing, the fact that nothing is independent, the fact that even words change their meaning, the fact that even teachings are dependent and therefore empty, all the stuff I keep on saying, is not nihilism. It's actually what allows things to interact with one another in the first place. If seeds were fixed, they were always a seed, they could never become apples. If apples were always apples, they can never become compost. You see? If people had souls that were always fixed, there could be no learning. There could be no change. There could be no interaction with other people. If language was always fixed, there could be no communication. This is the whole idea of emptiness. Things have to be radically open. This is the claim for interaction to happen in the first place. And therefore, emptiness, the non-fixedness of things, is, in a way, the greatest moral teaching. Because it explains cause and effect. Now, the trick is that cause and effect doesn't just happen willy-nilly. As we've said, just because apple seeds are not fixed, they're dependent, right? It's different to put an apple seed on the desk than to put it in the ground. It's different to put it in the ground than to put it into soil with nutrients. It's different to put it into soil with nutrients in a dry, arid environment than to put into a soil with nutrients in a wet, lush environment with sunlight. It's different to put into the ground in, I don't know, like the southwest of the United States in 2026 than it will be in 2046, than it was in 1006, than it was aeons ago when, dinosaurs were around, right? So these things are always shifting, and yet cause and effect still functions. It's not magic, right? So what's the skillfulness about? The skillfulness is literally and figuratively knowing, right, as a teacher, as a human being, right, when to plant an apple seed and when to plant an orange seed or when not to plant anything at all. Not because the apple seed itself is fixed, but because in certain environments, the apple seed is going to grow into a tree. In some environments, it's helpless. You see? In some environments, you spend a lifetime learning to bake the perfect bread with well-sourced wheat, right? Right? And then in other cases, you don't serve that well-served, well-sourced wheat baking product or a loaf of bread because, I don't know, the guests are coming over celiac, right? Or are gluten intolerant. There's nothing fixed about a good loaf of bread, if you think about it. And as we all know with bread, good loaf of bread, 5 minutes later, it feels like, but certainly a day or two later, isn't the same bread, right? But that doesn't mean there isn't skillfulness. The problem here is recognizing that our Emotional attachments to things being fixed is what gets us into trouble at the first place. So I mentioned this ever so quickly and unskillfully earlier, but to come back to the point, this is why Buddhist philosophers in the Mahayana tradition care about emptiness. The problem is not that we live in a world with all these changing, unstable phenomenon. It's that we get attached to fixing them. Today's the day I keep everything in control. I'm organized in my schedule. I participate in the right activities, whether they're physical activities or intellectual activities or religious activities or whatever it might be. So finally, someday in the future, whenever it is, everything will be fixed. Things will be where they're supposed to be. They'll belong in the supermarket, right? Everything will taste the way it's supposed to taste. The price will be fixed in the right proper way. Everyone will have access to that food because it'll be a moral world, and so on and so forth, right? We all do these things, by the way. By the way, some like profoundly moral, skillful human beings might even think this way. But ultimately, we're disappointed. Why? Because of the attachment to the fixed nature of things, right? Harumph, this apple that looks so beautiful in Whole Foods tastes mealy or is bland. It's not a real apple. It's not the apple I wanted, you see? Or the human being, my significant other, or my family member, or my child, or whoever, or my president of the United States, right? But this isn't to say that nothing matters, you see? Because if it's just nihilism, you say, well, who cares? This person's a saint, this person's a sinner, what's the difference? That is a total misunderstanding. In fact, one of the arguments that they make often in these Buddhist texts is that emptiness is slippery. It's so dangerous. That's why you need to have a good teacher. I'm unfortunately not the right teacher here for this, but you want to have a good teacher because if you try to grasp emptiness unskillfully or when you're not prepared, it's like grasping a snake. Even if you grasp it, it's going to bite you. And this is what they mean. You say, the world is less fixed than I thought it was. Things are open and changing and everything is possible. So therefore, in some sense, nothing matters. I just have to be skillful. So I'll behave like a lunatic, do whatever I want. And then what happens is you harm people. Why? Because of cause and effect. So this is a really tricky piece. The way in which emptiness allows for change. I mean, there's always change. You don't need emptiness for it. But emptiness is the principle in the sense that it explains why things are always shifting, but also why it's possible to be skillfully engaging with this world of open possibilities. And yet it's also why cause and effect functions for folks who remember fondly or unfondly, the fall is why karma works, which is really moral cause and effect. It's because things are always shifting. If you had an eternal soul, you would never experience all the changes of karma. But because things are always interacting and shifting, that's why karma function. That's why cause and effect functions. Excuse me. So to kind of get to the punchline here, in terms of our class, the use of changing non-fixed ideas like speaking English or teaching the Four Truths or teaching emptiness itself or teaching Buddha nature or teaching whatever else it might be, right? You know, the Trinity and the principle of love or turning the other cheek, all sorts of beautiful religious ideas that people have, is because conventions function skillfully or unskillfully. And I think we've all had experiences of this with religious ideas, but any ideas work this way. You know, like the idea of freedom, for example. Right? It can be a skillful, beautiful concept that, if applied properly, can open up worlds of possibility, or it can be used as a justification for something horrible. You know, we have new examples of this. Freedom isn't really the catchword that people use, thinking about, let's say, past military actions, but you can see what I mean, right? That ideas are flexible. That's beautiful because it means that people can interact with ideas skillfully. We can respond to them. Our ideas can shift. And there are cause and effect to the way that we use these conventions. It can be really problematic. All right. So this gets back to the bottom line. Things aren't chaos, even though they're empty, from the perspective of the Mahayana. Why? Because skillfulness is possible. You see, skillfulness is not fixed. There's no moral rule book, in a sense, which, by the way, if it makes you nervous, it makes everybody nervous. This idea that there's no fixed moral rule book. Even the Four Truths isn't fixed or always true in a sense. But that doesn't mean skillfulness is impossible. So this is why in the Mahayana it's such an emphasis on not only learning the ideas that help us to limit our attachment. Why? Because limiting our attachment limits our suffering, but also an embrace of the openness of things allows for skillfulness, because skillfulness is necessary. Otherwise, people are just going to keep on suffering. Which is why even the teaching of Buddha nature needs to be skillful. From the perspective of Mahayana, Buddha nature needs to be an idea that's skillfully delivered to kind of lift up our confidence about the possibility of liberation, all beings. Even the idea that some quality of our experience, maybe our awareness, is like a piece of gold, even if it's hidden under refuse, right? That it's always perfect, but it's got to be delivered skillfully. Otherwise, we're going to say, great, I knew it, Buddha nature, that's my eternal soul. Which, by the way, if for people on Zoom, the eternal soul is great news, that's fine. No personal critique here from your professor at the moment, but that's obviously not the idea that the Buddhist tradition is delivering here. Is that clear? Because of the anxiety that we get attached to our eternal souls. And for them, that's going to be a no-go for liberation. So even an idea like Buddha nature is empty. It participates in cause and effect relationships and can skillfully taught to help move people along the path of dropping expectations of things. That's part of the path. That's the emptiness. And yet it can go awry. You can imagine, right? And in fact, we have a lot of these ideas already in our culture, that things are totally interconnected globally. Therefore, there's no fixed meaning, there's no fixed morals. Therefore, anything goes. Therefore, only the powerful win, right? And everyone else is suckers, right? Because we all know morality is relative, so why even participate? Better just have a big gun and win and get stuff. I mean, being a little bit unfair here, but these kinds of ideas are everywhere. Why? Because it's true. Recognition of interconnection and change and unfixedness is dangerous, just like the snake, right? It can bite you. And yet, for the tradition, as modeled, I hope, in these chants that I showed you, right? Emptiness represents this like greatest possibility of universal transformation, helped by the skillful conventional use of emptiness teachings, right? By awakened beings and others. And therefore, there is really the possibility of, right, recognizing this empty reality in a way that allows us to drop our suffering. So there's tremendous, let's say, ambition and optimism in emptiness teachings and tremendous recognition of the danger, both. So let's see if there's any more here on the slideshow, but we're pretty close. Yeah, this idea here of skillfulness, right? Meeting audiences members where they are means recognizing the openness of situations, the emptiness of situations. There's no set rule book, and yet cause and effect functions, which is why one needs to be literally skillful, flexible enough to adapt, you see? But that doesn't mean over adapting and thinking anything goes. All right, I think that's more than enough of confusion, I hope, that I've introduced here. But I hope, again, I'm trying to emphasize the optimistic part because this is really very much a central element of the Mahayana teaching, that there's a wonder in the world of constant change and that people really do skillfully embrace it. And that's something to celebrate. All right. I'm a little scared personally in terms of my lack of skillfulness about opening things to questions now. But of course, I'm happy to chat for however long people want to. Please, Sister Maria. I think that you're still on mute, though, Sister Maria, please. Maybe.
I can't, some reason tonight, I am not seeing what people are putting in the chat box. Can you read what's in there? Because there are a couple of things in there.
Sure. So the first one I see, and I'll bounce between the different chats, is Mary Lee was asking about the role of chanting and singing and music actually in skillfulness. Yeah, so that's a wonderful question. I'm not sure I could, speaking of skillfully, answer it, but every Mahayana tradition I know, including the Tibetan traditions, which are kind of jump off of the Mahayana model, acknowledge the skillfulness of chanting. I mean, chanting itself literally is the learning to transform our speech into something like enlightened speech, speech into skillful karmic activity, right? And so the best way to do it, or one of the best ways to do it, is in community with beautiful music, rhythmic chanting, right? That transforms both the experience of the chanters, but also generates a lot of positive karma. It's the
Mhm.
simplest way of thinking about it. So I wish I had a better, more like musicological answer for now, but absolutely to recognize this. And the nice thing is that there are very many different beautiful musical traditions, whether you're in Vietnam or China or Korea or Japan or other kind of Himalayan traditions, all of them part of the Mahayana tradition. Absolutely, yeah. Silence gets a kind of a lot of attention in the United States, partially because of the success of Zen, which is one form of Japanese Mahayana tradition, which is why people almost hilariously assume that Buddhist monks are quiet and always are meditating, which is really not true. Usually monasteries are very loud places for a whole variety of reasons. But you're absolutely right that there are certain traditions. There's a wonderful documentary, for example, about Korean Zen nuns having a silent retreat for something like 6 months. And so there absolutely are examples of the embrace of silence itself as skillfulness. So I want to acknowledge, of course, that's true. Yeah. Thank you. So let's see if I click through if there are any other questions here. I think there are just comments about sound. So again, apologies about the sound hiccup.
Right. And I think people can raise their hands now if they want to ask a question. Um, I wonder this, if everything is flux, that's basically what you're saying, I think. I mean, I think the Epicureans thought that philosophical group, and they had that
Mhm.
dictum that was associated with them: eat, drink, and be merry, because tomorrow you die. And I, you know, the church has been combating that kind of Catholic Church and Buddhism. I'm seeing a common idea. So there's the ability to accept that things are in flux and we're all interdependent. No one is absolutely separate. But I guess I'm wondering, like, how in the Buddhist tradition, how do they conceive of death? Is death something that is now um, fixed? Is that the one thing that's fixed after which? So can you talk a little bit about how death
Sure.
fits in this?
So there are plenty of wonderful teachings about death. Often teachings about death, for example, the ones I'm most common within the Tibetan tradition, are introduced as meditations to recognize the inevitability of death and the unpredictability of death in order to motivate people to like get going, get off the couch, right? But that's not really answering your question, Sis Maria. So the first, let's say, kind of most straightforward answer is harkening back to our discussions of karma and rebirth, that death is a change of your physical body, right? But
Right?
that doesn't mean that the continuity of mental experience, which by the way is also always changing, doesn't continue. So
Uh,
physical death of body doesn't mean the end. There's still the continuity of consciousness, which is why there's so much concern about rebirth, right? Which is why death is not insignificant, but it just marks a transition of consciousness to the, let's say, another body. Now,
right.
I wouldn't say a next stage because who knows? That stage could be another human being, human body, or it could be an animal body, or it could be a divine body, or it could be in hell realm. So it's not even a better place. Sometimes it's a worse place. Sometimes it's a better place. But I will say that there's a really beautiful biography. I don't remember if this came up earlier. I don't think so. Of a very popular, now internationally renowned Tibetan monk named Mingyur Rinpoche. He has a couple names, but I'll put this in the chat. And if someone reminds me, please, I'll add a link to his biography or his memoir below the YouTube video. And Mingyur Rinpoche, one of the teachings in this book, which he didn't invent, is recognizing how every moment is a small death, which is to say, truly recognizing the radical impermanence of experiences.
Oh, well.
Like 5 minutes ago is totally gone, and our experience at that moment is totally different. And this moment has the open possibility of totally different experiences. Now, to get back to the conversation we were having before, and cause and effect still functions. So just because I had a death 5 minutes ago virtually, let's say, doesn't mean that I start from scratch, right? I have all these lifetimes of past experiences, or if you don't want to go that far, at the very least, 47, 48 years of my own human experiences that are going to impact my capacity to speak now in English clearly or unclearly, with some references to past experiences, I hope, studying some Buddhism, so I'm not speaking nonsense, right? But also recognition of facial gestures. So I have some sense of the response of the few people here whose images I can see, right? I mean, so just because we have all these radical deaths at every moment, Sister Maria, doesn't
Mhm.
mean that cause and effect isn't still functioning. And
Okay.
yet there's a total openness. So this is a kind of a very common teaching you find that can be delivered really beautifully. And then again, I'll put his full name in here. Mingyur Rinpoche wrote a whole book about it. Yeah, Carol, please.
Um, Last week I think I had a question, but I think I'm still forming it. You might get the question next week.
Great.
But it just occurred to me that uh, in Catholicism and Buddhism, that really peace is the highest outcome of love. I don't know what my question is around that, but that's sort of where we ended off last week. But today, in talking about emptiness, it brings to mind something that Shanti said about Buddha, a Buddha story about the bowl. Um, and the story, just to make it short, is that Buddha was being insulted by the people in the village, and he
Mhm.
was walking with a student. He got back to his home. He took out a bowl, put it on the table. I'm shortening it. Um, Put it on the table and said, "Now, whose bowl is this?" And the student said, "It's your bowl." And so Buddha pushed it closer to the student and said, "Now, whose bowl is this?" And the student said, "It's still your bowl." And he did this again and again. And finally, he took the bowl, he got up and he went and he put it on the student's lap. And he said, "Now, whose bowl is this?" Um, and the student said, "It's still your bowl." And Buddha said, "Exactly. It's if you don't accept it, it's not yours." And
Mm.
I think that's a really good example for me for emptiness through skillfulness.
Yeah, that's a
Mm.
beautiful story. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, at some point, skillfulness is in a way the bottom line, but it's a bottom line without a bottom line, right? Because it
Mhm.
can't be defined in some sense, and yet there is cause and effect, right? I mean, it would have been a very different story if he hit the student over the head with the bowl and said, "Now whose bowl?" See, right? Which I don't know. Maybe in some cases it could be appropriate. You never know, right? But there is some recognition that certain kinds of teachings are going to elicit responses and others aren't, right? There is a reality in a sense. This emptiness isn't reality denying. It's more
Right.
like a more open recognition of how shifting that reality is. Yeah, but beautiful. Thank you, Carol, for sharing that story. It's great.
Joshua, I have another question. Um, you talked about we have notes I took from you. So, you talked about um, emptiness, understanding the fluidity, everything is changing all the time, should not lead, it's not a form of nihilism, and it shouldn't lead to just do whatever you want because there are cause and effect, there are consequences. I mean, but what if there are people who don't care about the consequences? I mean, what does Buddhism, and I hate to use this word, what constraints are there in Buddhist teaching? Because I mean, in Catholicism, um, there are cause and effects. You don't do anything you want because you could go to heaven or you could go to hell. So you have to. So there are moral laws, and then there are rewards and punishments. If you go berserko and say, well, I don't really give a damn about the consequences, I'm doing what I want. What are there are there constraints and consequences within Buddhist teaching so that someone doesn't go off the rails, right? with this idea of fluidity and impermanence and say, well, it really doesn't matter. I know that there are consequences, but even if I choose to do something that has terrible consequences for you, what difference does it make? Do you understand my question? I mean,
Yeah,
what
beautiful
difference?
question. Yeah. Well, karma. Karma's the answer.
That
So,
so in Buddhism, it's karma. You will. So is karma like
well, what I would say here about karma, to pick up on your question, I'd really appreciate
sure?
it, is that karma is not reward and punishment
That's what I want to know. It's not.
because there's no one levying the reward and punishment. It's cause and effect. It's the
Okay,
very same principle, right? That if I manipulate my monitor down, right, there's
right.
some kind of consequence. And if I hope speak respectfully to you, Sister Maria, or I call you names, you see, or whatever it might be, right? They're all equally going to have consequences. So one of them might be this physical consequence of the manipulation of material matter. Another might be the response of other human beings, both in the short term and the long term, but also the impact on my own mental expectations. So if I have a habit of speaking rudely to people, I will be more likely to have the habit of speaking rudely to people, which means I will live in an environment of people being impatient with me, and I would start viewing other human beings as impatient. And then if you're on board for the rebirth story, there might be some long-term consequences in my next body. So this kind of principle of karma is often parsed, especially in the Tibetan tradition I'm most familiar with, as cause and effect. But cause and effect does not ask for a reward or a punishment from someone watching. That's a very
Okay,
different
that's
principle.
the different. Okay,
So, but I hear your moral concern, and this often people will levy as a concern in like our contemporary environment, especially in a pluralistic environment, to say, well, like it's all very nice to be committed to this invisible moral cause and effect over multiple lifetimes,
right.
but how do we constrain human beings? And so different Buddhist communities have had different solutions to that. And it hasn't always been the Buddhist job in the community to be the police folks, you know? I mean,
Uh-huh.
I don't have a singular answer there. In a way, that's an anthropological question. But in theory, I think the explanations that you see in, let's say, the more philosophical or theological oriented text would be cause and effect happens no matter if you like it or not. If you're scared or not, it's going to happen, you know. And in fact, we don't have to worry or ensure that people are punished for their behaviors in this sense because the very effects of their experience is going to be its own punishment.
Hmm.
But before we get lost now, I just don't want to suggest that that's somehow like a geopolitical policy or a policy for like policing a peaceful society, or like it's not a good policy for running New York City, let me put it that way, you see.
Right.
But it's I don't really think that there are all that many examples of this idea of just open recognition of emptiness and karma being the social strategy for running a pluralistic metropolis. Does that make sense? It's not exactly a political philosophy.
Got it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Others, you have about one more minute. Anybody else comment, question? Um, again, it's a mental gymnastics here every Thursday night. I just love it. I don't know what I'd do without it on Thursday nights. So very grateful to you and grateful to all of you who are here with us tonight. Joshua, while he was speaking before, mentioned, alluded to the kind of world that we're living in, and the kind of concerns and upset that we have every day. Just today, um, there were incredible acts of violence against a temple in Michigan. I think a Jewish uh, school with 130 children in there, and a man drove a truck through, and I think elsewhere, something else happened today. I mean, whatever is happening in our world, you feel like the unleashing of a kind of uh, violence that I think is getting harder each day to look at. One of the Catholic bishops said this week, watching bombings through drones and murdering of people, but it was almost like just regular TV. We're becoming almost immune to what is happening in the world. So maybe tonight, all of us who are here and seeking enlightenment can just pause for a moment and pray to whoever we wish to pray for, that somehow, if there is a God, that the God of peace brings wisdom to the leaders of the world so they stop this insanity and this useless murder, and that we return to some form of civility and stability. Good night, everyone. Thank you for coming. See you next Thursday. Rest up, because I think it's going to be another challenging night. Good night, everybody. God bless you. Bye, Joshua. See
everyone.
you
Good
next
night.
week, okay? Bye.